Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and today we're going to be talking about a specific free motion quilting design, which is Paisleys. Now, this one is specifically about this design, but just know that I do have a blog post up on general tips for free motion quilting, tension control, speed control, helping those stitches look even, kind of just getting started. So you can check that out if you want to, and I will link that in the description. So let's look at this quilt. This is my Sew Diamond quilt. And I made this quilt knowing that it was going to get to be on display at Bernina University back in June. So I was on my best behavior. I wanted it to look really nice. And Paisleys are a design that I tend to use a lot when I want to do a lot of quilting and want it to kind of look fancy. And I kind of think of Paisleys as being pretty similar to feathers, except for a lot less fuss. So if I was going to quilt a feather, I would quilt a long wavy line or a circle first. It's kind of like a guideline and the spine to that feather. But with the Paisleys, you don't have to do that. You're really just quilting and working your way around that quilt, wiggling around and filling up the space, just like you would do with your more beginner-friendly designs like stipples or loops or double C's. And while I wouldn't necessarily call this a beginner design, it's also not as hard as it looks. There do end up being a lot of points for you so that if you need to stop and readjust your hands, you can do that. So let's have a look at this on some notebook paper first, because when I was first starting to learn quilting, I thought it was kind of helpful to draw out the design first, because it kind of helps keep your brain used to the size and the shape of the designs that you're going to want to make. So one thing about Paisleys, I tend to do 3 loops. And the reason for that is whatever direction you start going in, if you do 3 loops or any odd number of loops, that's where you'll end up. So you can kind of help plan your direction. So let's get started. So we're going to start, we're going to make sort of a cross between a teardrop and a half of a heart. Come to the point and then go echoing around and then echo back to the other side. So there's 3 loops. We're going to do the same thing with a leaf or a paisley that's going in the other direction. So and it is kind of hard to draw this while I'm also holding the camera, but you get the idea. So, just wiggling around and filling up the space. And I tend to start in the middle of the quilt with a design like this, kind of this 3-pronged paisley. Now, if I want to come back down to the bottom, I can just echo around this leaf that I've made. And I don't have to bring this all the way back to that point right here. I can just stop here. And now I've come to the bottom. I'm heading in the other direction, because in your finished quilt, you'll want your paisleys kind of going every which way. So what if I forget which direction I want to go. I accidentally go in the wrong direction. Let's say I want to go one direction but ended up going the other. So there are a few things that you can do about that. So I've drawn my 3 loops and I decide that's really not where I want to be. So one thing I can do is I can just go with it and correct the direction on the next paisley. So and now I'm going the direction I want to go. Or another thing I can do is, and watch right here, I don't have a lot of room to come in there, so I'm not going to make that a full loop. I'm just going to stop right here. And that's fine. It's not going to look weird in your quilt because you're going to put so many of these on there that that's not going to be something that anybody notices. So I've made my 3 loops, and that's really not the way I want to go. So I could also just add a 4th loop on that paisley. I've been quilting a lot of paisleys, and I have never had a 4th loop on a paisley that actually hurt anybody. So another situation that you may run into is, what if, and I'm going to add a 4th loop to this paisley, what if you end up leaving a little more space somewhere than you intended? Sorry, I just drew over that little hole. So what if you leave a little bit more space somewhere than you intended to do? So I've got this little space here. I can go in there, and I'm not going to be able to fit 3, so I can just do 2 loops, or even just 1. So we're just wiggling around, kind of getting our brain used to drawing it, and you'll have an easier time doing this, practicing drawing this than I am right now, because I'm using my hand to hold the camera and also watching this through the camera instead of being able to watch it on paper. So it'll be easier for you than it is for me right now. So look right there, I left a little space there, and it's probably going to be kind of hard for me to go in this way. So look what I can do. I can just come through here, make my loop, and then come out. And let's go back up here. So you're just wiggling around, taking your paisleys in lots of different directions, filling up space. And if you have space like this here in places, that's fine too. It's not going to make a difference. The nice thing about freehand is that they all look different. So when one is not exactly right, it's not going to look weird. And another thing, that's another advantage of dense quilting, is that it hides the mistakes that you do make. All right, so now that we've drawn some of these, let's get to our sewing machine, and I'll show you the paisleys in action. Okay, so we're ready to start quilting. I do like to wind up some extra bobbins at the beginning just so that I don't have to stop as often to wind more. This particular quilt is my Rella's Diamonds quilt. The pattern is free and already available on Bendertech's site. I'll put the link to that in the description. And I've got my free motion quilting foot on. This is just the standard closed toe hopper foot. It's the one that comes standard with your machine. Thread I'm using today is from Missouri Star Quilt Company. This is their 40 weight polyester quilting thread, and the color is Asian blue. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to do some paisleys, and the first thing you want to do before you start quilting is to bring your bobbin thread up to the top. So you're just going to put your needle down and back up, and you'll just thread this through. And when you put your needle back down, you need to go in close to the spot where that thread is coming out. Then you'll put your foot down and get my gloves on here. And you'll want to hold on to the end of these thread tails before you start sewing, or otherwise they'll pull through and knot up on you. So we're going to do that 3-pronged paisley that I showed you. That's the first thing I always do when I start quilting paisleys. And then after that, we just wiggle around and fill up the space from there. I'm just going to stop for a second and move my thread out of my way, and we'll start that other leaf. So now that we've got those first 3, and notice we did 3 loops on all the Paisleys. Now that we've got those first 3 going, I'm going to come down here a little more. So we're going to start heading in the other direction. We have plenty of points we can stop at if we need to readjust our hands. So now that I've got my 3rd loop on there, I see that I am not going in the direction I want to go. So I can either start another Paisley and get my direction corrected that way, or I can just make a 4th loop. A 4th loop on a Paisley never hurt anybody. So I'm just going to make a 4th loop and get myself down here where I want to be. You can see I just made 2 on that one, but this is I want to stay in this direction, so I'm just gonna leave that one with 2. So, you know, you can do 2 loops, 3 loops, 4 loops, whatever you want to do. It's not gonna matter. You're just wiggling your way around and filling up the space. Okay, so now that we've done a few Paisleys, we're gonna zoom out, and I'm just gonna let you see the whole process. So right here you can see I left a little bit too much space, probably not enough for 3 loops. So we're just going to fill that space with 2 loops or even just 1. So you see that if you end up going in the wrong direction, have some space to fill, it's not that big of a deal. You can add extra loops, add less loops. You're really just wiggling around and filling up the space.